the Szabo cast. Here we discuss all things from a working class, trans, anarchist, analytical perspective. Due to the nature of this show, listener discretion is advised. My name is Skylar, my pronouns are she, they, they, and I'm your host. Thank you for joining us today. We need to remember that sometimes we do win. Sometimes we have those impressive victories that often get overlooked. Of course, in moments like this, we need to give a positive shout out to the Positive Leftist News channel, which is hosted by Mexi. But at the same time, we need to also remember that that job of informing us of our victories, it's not a job that only one of us should do, but all of us should be involved in that actually. All of us should remember the great moments that we've had together and the great moments that sometimes coincidentally fall right into our lap. And that's what this episode is for. This is for those coincidental victories that we sometimes have. But there's also some underlying truth and some underlying, murkiness. And sometimes we do need to be mindful that while there are good times to be had, there are definitely moments of truth within the murkiness of it all. You'll see what I mean as we go through it all, because I've got 3 nominations for this particular episode that I think are worth talking about. The first one is that Kyle Rittenhouse is broke. We need to remember that Kyle Rittenhouse found himself in this situation because he crossed state lines and committed a mass shooting. He killed 2 individuals and injured 1 person, which is quite a fucking tale if he didn't also get away with it. Because in November of 2022, the court found him not guilty on any of these charges, which is just maddening, right? It should be something that should really grind your gears, if anything. And it also kind of goes back into my previous episode where I talked about how the police and law enforcement do not take mass shootings seriously. In fact, on the contrary, especially if you are in the state of California. But of course, it's not just a singular issue that only grew to prominence in the state of California. It's a nationwide issue. There's the Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, Texas. There's the Buffalo mass shooting that was hosted by a white supremacist Twitch streamer. And of course the Lewiston, Maine police, who did not have any fucking capacity to stop a white supremacist mass shooter while harassing an unarmed black pedestrian named Con Maywan. We've been through this before. We've talked about this already. This is already covered ground on the channel and in the podcast, so I'm not going to repeat too much of it. But essentially, the concept of mass shootings is a parade field for law enforcement, because law enforcement can then drive up the narrative are essential to our safety as a community, which, if you've been listening to any of the Black Lives Matter protests, that is not the case. Every time law enforcement gets funded, people die. More people die than there should be. According to the University of Utah of Law in a study of 2020, the police in the United States only prevent 2% of all crime, which is a really poor batting average if it were a baseball team. Again, we've been through this before. We've talked about this statistic in general, but what makes Kyle Rittenhouse so interesting is that he is a Blue Lives Matter supporter, and he got away with doing this mass shooting in court. Not to mention that the police, during the night of this shooting, actually supported him and collaborated with him. He crossed state lines, got a gun under the age of 18, and did a mass shooting, and the cops were like, "That's cool, we like that." Not to mention the cops did not arrest him after he did the mass shooting. It's a very popular clip that goes around with his image on it. It shows the double standard of the police and how very little they take mass shootings seriously. And of course, we need to remember that the reason why that he even did this in the first place was because there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which, by the way, happened because of Jacob Blake getting shot in the back by law enforcement. Thankfully, Jacob Blake survived to tell this story, but this whole fiasco came right after the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd committed by Derek Chauvin, which is another thing that I want to talk about real quick. It is another piece of good news for us all, because that bitch got stabbed in jail. But wait, let's take a moment to slow down. Who even is Derek Chauvin? A former Minneapolis police officer who killed George Floyd. And the point I always make with Derek Chauvin is that Derek Chauvin, no matter what consequences he faced, legally speaking, he got a due process. George Floyd did not get a due process. And this is specifically what makes law enforcement in the United States incredibly white supremacist in its very nature. Now, Derek Chauvin got stabbed, but he didn't die, as far as I'm aware as of recording this. But guess what? Henry Kissinger died. He died a little too late at age 100, for crying out loud. And within 100 years, he's committed some of the most heinous war crimes that are known to man. So this is what I was talking about, friends. These are great news, but they have devastating and negative impacts that are absolutely worth talking about in detail. And I want to talk a little bit further about each of these points. First of all, Kyle Rittenhouse is and still will always be a little bitch until he changes his perspective, because he claims that he shot in self-defense at the 3 men that he crossed the state border to go shoot. Which, by the way, sounds like claiming that Israel is invading Palestine as a form of self-defense. But I digress. We're talking about American politics here. Everything that involves imperialism and state violence, that's apparently self-defense to the United States. Incredibly backwards logic, but whatever, okay. Here's the thing, however. That may be in the past, and yes, there are some people who lost their lives for this. But Kyle Rittenhouse is broke? Why don't we look into that just a little further? According to Mark Richards, who is Kyle Rittenhouse's lawyer, he says he is working, he is trying to support himself. Everybody thinks that Kyle Rittenhouse got so much money from this, whatever money he did get is gone. Mark Richards continues by saying he's living, I don't want to say paycheck to paycheck, but he's living to support himself. Obviously, as his lawyer and somebody who I want to do well, I hope he does re-engage in his studies. But right now, he's working full-time. He is living a law-abiding life, and he is doing something that he enjoys. So I think stating that Kyle Rittenhouse is broke is a little bit of an understatement. It seems that he's living a rather stable financial life, and stating that he's broke is like saying that he can't afford laundry or he can't afford rent. A man by the name of John Huber, the father of Anthony Huber, who is one of the guys that Kyle Rittenhouse killed on that night, is suing for a wrongful death. And he's also suing the Kenosha Police Department for violating his son's constitutional rights, which is a huge thing to claim. However, Kyle Rittenhouse, broke-ass Kyle Rittenhouse, raised $250,000 in legal defense funds. Are you fucking stupid? Does Kyle Rittenhouse not know how to fucking budget his money? Are you serious right now? Because either way, it has come to my attention that Kyle Rittenhouse is being abandoned by his fan base. I mean, granted, there are still a bunch of creeps out there who still follow this literal child, but I mean, like, being able to legally represent yourself in court, especially after killing people in a shooting, that's a lot of fucking work for you to do. It's becoming expensive, buddy. And I just find it a little silly that after the initial lawsuits that took place in 2022, and then all of a sudden after the acquittal, that all of the money just vanished? That shit is fucking bonkers, buddy. What the hell? Why is Kyle Rittenhouse getting all this money? I would have assumed that perhaps he would have spent a little bit of it during Christmas on Call of Duty or whatever the fuck these kids get these days. Or maybe a subscription to Xbox Live or something. I don't fucking know what these kids are doing these days. Oh, I'm getting old, buddies. But the thing I feel like we all need to remember here is that with Kyle Rittenhouse and with the people I'm about to segue into next, we need to remember that these are standards that are being held differently than any other regular person. One thing I'm hearing with people who support law enforcement with the stabbing of Derek Chauvin is that people think that Derek Chauvin should be exposed to the same elements, the same kinds of good-natured elements that are in prisons. If that's what you think prisons are, then you don't know what prisons are. Prison is a place for the end of life as we know it. Derek Chauvin getting stabbed in prison is like the bare fucking minimum as to what can happen to Derek Chauvin. He got it off easy. Because while Derek Chauvin got stabbed, George Floyd got murdered. And no matter how you spin this, at the end of the day, you are sympathizing with a murderer, just a state-sanctioned murderer. People in prison are forced to do labor for corporations that literally commodify prison labor. If you're transgender, they misgender you by putting you in a gendered prison, thus increasing your likelihood of getting sexually assaulted in prison. And that is a uniquely specific punishment that trans people specifically go through when we go to prison. Unlike Derek Chauvin, who doesn't have to worry about being misgendered and raped. So if you're trying to reciprocate the kinds of treatment that prisoners get in prison, with Derek Chauvin stating that Derek Chauvin being stabbed is unjustified, then my friends, I think you are either misunderstanding the true nature of what a prison is and what it does, or you are only advocating for more violence against Derek Chauvin, because you are now demonstrating that you don't know the purpose of prisons and what they do. Prisons are known to be correctional, but they're anything but correctional. If it was correctional, all of these problems that we see in our society would cease to exist. I want to read an excerpt from a piece of writing that was written by Peter Kropotkin, and this is a piece called Prisons, University of Crime. It starts by saying, leaving aside the great question of crime and punishment, which occupies now so many prominent lawyers and sociologists, I shall submit my remarks to the question, are prisons answering their purpose, which is that of diminishing the number of antisocial acts? To this question, every unprejudiced person who has a knowledge of prisons from the inside will certainly answer with an empathetic no. Peter Kropotkin then argues that the concept of prisons is specifically to incentivize the return of criminals because of their criminal behavior, that prisons are not a place for correction, in fact on the contrary. And because prisons, especially in the United States today, have incentivized an industrial purpose, it is now to be considered, rightfully so, a prison industrial complex. And thus the role of the prison is no longer to incentivize the abolition of crime and antisocial behavior, but on the contrary, it is to accelerate this behavior for the sake of profit. We're going to move from Derek Chauvin and Kyle Rittenhouse, however, and we're going to graduate to Henry Kissinger, because Henry Kissinger being dead now is a good thing, but what he left behind was some really horrific shit. Henry Kissinger is known to be a Holocaust survivor, and I would think that if you lived through the Holocaust, you would think that maybe this would be something that you would learn as a lesson to not repeat throughout history. And unfortunately, that's what his legacy ends up becoming, is exactly that, repeating history. In 1968, Henry Kissinger was involved in the My Lai massacre, which killed over 800 Vietnamese civilians, women and children included. This is one of many war crimes that Henry Kissinger was involved with, because his response to this whole entire thing was that there needed to be a press policy or a game plan, to use his words, to respond to the press covering this issue. So the My Lai Massacre Task Force was created with the sole purpose of discrediting any kind of opposition or whistleblowers. You know, people who were there to witness the event. This was an attempt for the United States government to control the narrative as to how the My Lai Massacre was covered both in the press and in the public. And for that, Henry Kissinger won a Nobel-ass Peace Prize. This is crazy. So a year later, in 1969, when President Nixon got elected, it halted Lyndon B. Johnson's attempt at being able to make peace negotiations with the Vietnamese. And would you fucking believe it that Henry Kissinger was promoted to be the role of the National Security Advisor, and this only prolonged the war, killing millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians. Speaking of Cambodia, Henry Kissinger's role in the Vietnamese War only expanded the Khmer Rouge rule in Cambodia, and that shit killed 2 million people, a fifth of the fucking population of Cambodia. The term carpet bombing comes from this, because to this very day, people in Cambodia are still being killed by unexploded United States planted bombs. What about Bangladesh? Because in East Pakistan at the time, which what it was called, the Bengali nationalists won an election. But very similar to how the Afghan war was fought as a proxy war with the Mujahideens fighting the Soviets, this was an attempt for Kissinger and Nixon to support the slaughter of over 300,000 or 3 million people committed by the West Pakistani military government. The next atrocity is more widely known today, but the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, who was a self-proclaimed Marxist and the first Marxist to ever win a democratic election in Latin American history. There was $11 million put into destabilizing Allende's government that it eventually led into the coup that took place on September 11, 1973, and replaced it with Augusto Pinochet, one of the most brutal fascist dictators in Latin American history. So brutal that during his 17-year rule, 3,000 people either disappeared or were killed, and then of course 10,000 of his political opponents were imprisoned. And Kissinger's response to this when talking with President Nixon, he said, quote, "We didn't do it. I mean, we helped them." I could go on. We could talk about East Timor, Cyprus, Israel, Argentina, South Africa, China. These are all stories that resulted in thousands, if not millions of people experiencing devastating impacts that affected their culture, their stability, their democracy. It rendered them unable to pick themselves back up on their own 2 feet. There's no bootstrap theory to be applied here. And so when you look at the media and you hear about his war crimes, especially when it comes to the mainstream media, these war crimes are unfortunately considered as alleged. And the reason why his death may be a good thing in the short term, but in the long term it's not that meaningful here, is because his crimes against humanity were never corrected. They were never analyzed, and he was never really put on trial for any of these horrific acts of evil. And so this is why when we look at cases like Kyle Rittenhouse going broke or Derek Chauvin getting stabbed, we look at the stories that were told by Henry Kissinger's actions, and we have to think to ourselves, there is no means of being able to correct these crimes against humanity by the state itself. Because let's face it, the state is not the least bit interested in holding war criminals or crimes that are committed by law enforcement or crimes that are committed by sympathetic people towards law enforcement accountable. And this is why I will always say that the state is inherently, by default, self-interested in maintaining power. It is not interested in creating a just society. It is only interested into feeding its own monopoly on violence. Anyway, friends, that's really all I wanted to share today. I wanted to talk about these things in detail, but these were too short of topics to really go into like a whole singular episode. So I wanted to put all these together and maybe draw some sort of story or lesson to be learned from it. Because I do think that at the end of the day, we gotta always remember that when we use the state to enact any kind of justice, it's proven to be unreliable consistently at an atrocious level. So anyway, I wish you all the best. Hope you all are staying safe. If you are at where it is cold, I hope you are staying warm and drinking soup and drinking cocoa and enjoying your time indoors. And if you got friends who are out on the street in the cold, either bring them in or give them something useful like cocoa or blankets or socks, underwear, sanitizers, masks, what have you. Give them something that will improve their winter. That's it. Thank you for joining. I'm Skylar. See you next time.